It wasn't the size of the bull that stopped every man on the Clearwater Ranch dead in their tracks. It was the silence before it moved. Hadley Voss had heard about Iron Ridge the same way she'd heard about most things in Pincher Creek, Alberta. Do the kind of talk that travels faster than weather. A Hereford cross, they said, 1,800 pounds of muscle and memory. And the memory was the dangerous part. 3 handlers in 2 years. 1 broken collarbone, 1 cracked rib, 1 man who simply packed his truck and drove east without saying goodbye. The owner of Clearwater, a widower named Douglas Fenn, had stopped putting men in the pen with the bull altogether. The animal stood in his pasture like a stone that had learned to breathe. Hadley arrived on a Tuesday in late April, when the foothills still held patches of dirty snow and the sky looked like it couldn't make up its mind. She was 26 years old, drove a rusted Silverado with a broken heater, and carried a letter of recommendation from a livestock veterinarian in Lethbridge that Douglas had never called to verify. She wasn't what he'd pictured when the agency in Calgary sent her name. She was too young, for one thing, and she was alone. Douglas met her at the gate with his hat already down against the wind, and he looked at her the way men on working ranches look at anything that doesn't immediately make sense. His foreman, a lean man named Pete Dalgetty, stood 2 steps behind with his arms crossed and didn't bother pretending he wasn't skeptical. The agency said you had experience with difficult cattle, Douglas said. I do, Hadley said. Iron Ridge has put 3 handlers off this property. I know. That's why I applied. Douglas looked at Pete. Pete looked at the sky. She was shown to the bunkhouse room that the last handler had left behind. A single mattress, a nail in the wall, where something used to hang. A window that faced the north pasture. She stood at that window for a long time her first night, watching the shape of Iron Ridge move slow and purposeful through the dark, and she thought about her father's place outside of Stavely, the cattle operation she'd grown up on before the bank took most of it, and her father took the rest with him when he left. She had learned animals the way some children learn languages. Not from books, not from instruction, but from proximity and patience, and the particular kind of attention that only comes when you have nothing else to pay attention to. She didn't go near the bull that first week. This bothered Pete more than he expected. He watched her work, competent, quiet, thorough, and then watched her walk the fence line of Iron Ridge's pasture at a distance, just standing, just watching, and he couldn't figure out what she was waiting for. You planning on doing something about that animal? He asked her on the 5th day, leaning against the water trough for the coffee that had gone cold. Yes, Hadley said. When? When he tells me he's ready. Pete snorted. Bull's not going to tell you anything. He already has, she said. He told me he doesn't trust fast movement. He told me he doesn't like being looked at directly. He told me whatever happened to him before he got here was loud. Pete looked at her for a long moment. Douglas is going to ask me tonight whether you know what you're doing. What are you going to tell him? He picked up his cold coffee. I haven't decided yet. The other hands were less careful about their opinions. There were 4 of them. Seasonal workers who came back year after year because Douglas paid fairly and didn't micromanage, and they'd watched the bull destroy the confidence of better credentialed people than Hadley, and they had the easy skepticism of men who'd seen enough to know how these things usually went. Not cruel about it, just certain. At dinner the 2nd week, one of them, a big, good-natured man from Red Deer named Corey, asked her what the plan was. He wasn't hostile. He was genuinely curious. The way people are curious about magic tricks before they decide whether to believe in them. I'm going to spend time near him, Hadley said. Until near isn't a threat anymore. Then? And then, closer. Corey glanced down the table. And then what? Closer again. Until there's no distance left that means anything. The table was quiet for a moment. That could take months, Douglas said from the head of the table. It might, Hadley said. Is that a problem? Douglas looked at his plate. He had a daughter in Red Deer who called twice a week and wanted him to sell the ranch and move into town, and a son in Vancouver who didn't call at all, and a wife 3 years in the ground whose name he still said out loud sometimes when he thought no one was nearby. The ranch was what he had left that was fully his own. The bull, this impossible, expensive, infuriating animal, was somehow part of that. He hadn't been able to bring himself to sell Iron Ridge or put him down, though every practical reason pointed there. No, he said. It's not a problem. She started at the fence line. Every morning, 40 minutes, same spot, same time. She didn't bring anything with her. No bucket, no rope, no show of intention. She just stood. Iron Ridge kept to the far end of the pasture for the first 3 days. A dark shape that moved when she moved, mirroring distance. On the 4th day, he came to 30 meters and stopped. On the 6th day, he came to 20 and stood there for a long time, his breath visible in the cold morning air, watching her the way animals watch when they're trying to understand something that isn't a predator but isn't entirely safe either. She didn't look directly at him. She looked slightly past, at the line of spruce along the south fence. She kept her hands loose at her sides. She breathed slowly. On the 8th day, he came to 10 meters and dropped his head to graze. And Hadley felt something in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. Not triumph, nothing so sharp as that. More like recognition. Like a door in a familiar house swinging open on its own. Pete saw it from across the yard. He didn't say anything. But that evening he told Douglas that maybe the girl knew something after all. The crisis came in the 3rd week, and it had nothing to do with the bull. One of the ranch dogs, a 3-year-old border collie named Scout that belonged to everyone and no one in the particular way of working dogs, got into the south pasture fence during a windstorm and was badly cut along the flank. Douglas was in Pincher Creek at the feed supplier. Pete was down the road dealing with a fence line that had blown flat. Hadley was the one who found Scout, and Scout was the one who kept moving in panic circles, bleeding into the dirt, and Iron Ridge was in the next pasture, not 20 feet from where Hadley needed to work. She had to make a decision. She climbed the fence with the first aid kit from the barn and went to the dog without running, moving the way she'd trained herself to move around the bull. Steady, deliberate, nothing sudden. Scout was frightened and the blood was worse than it looked, and Iron Ridge came to the fence line between the 2 pastures and stood there watching all of it, his enormous head up, reading the air. Hadley talked while she worked. Not to the dog, though she talked to Scout too. She talked generally, quietly, the low, even murmur she'd been using for weeks near the bull's fence. The voice that meant nothing is wrong here. Nothing has changed. You don't need to do anything about this. She claimed the wound and got pressure on it, and kept talking, and Iron Ridge stood at that fence for 22 minutes without moving, without making a sound, watching with those dark, cautious eyes. When Douglas got back and saw the dog bandaged and resting in the barn and heard from Pete what had happened, he went looking for Hadley. He found her at the water trough, washing her hands. There was still blood on her jacket. You went into that pasture with the dog bleeding, he said. Scout needed help. You could have waited for Pete or me. Scout couldn't wait. Douglas stood there for a moment in the way he had, not cold, but measured, like a man who'd learned not to spend words faster than he earned them. The bull didn't react, he said. No, because of what you've been doing. Hadley dried her hands. Because he's been deciding whether to trust things. I think today helped him decide. Douglas looked toward the north pasture, where Iron Ridge was grazing in the late light like an ordinary animal. I've had that bull for 3 years, he said. I've never seen him stand that still near an emergency. He doesn't need to be afraid anymore, Hadley said. He just needed someone to show him that. Douglas didn't respond, but he didn't leave either, and they stood there together for a minute in the particular quiet of late afternoon on the foothills, and something in the space between them shifted without either of them naming it. The other hand started talking to her differently after that. Not overnight. Nothing on a working ranch changes overnight, but gradually, the way trust actually builds. Corey started saving her a place at the table without thinking about it. The youngest hand, a 19-year-old from Clarisholm named Wade, who'd been the most performatively skeptical, started asking her questions about cattle handling that weren't tests, just questions. Pete began including her in the morning planning without Douglas having to prompt it. But there were still hard days. The agency that had placed her, a livestock staffing service in Calgary, had a policy about trial periods, and the standard was 60 days. That day 45, Douglas received a call from the owner of a larger operation near Fort Macleod, who'd heard about the Clearwater situation and wanted to know if Hadley would be available when her trial was up. The offer was considerable, more than Douglas was paying, substantially more, with a housing stipend and a longer contract. Pete mentioned it to Hadley. He didn't mean to. It came out sideways in a conversation about winter prep. He regretted it immediately. Hadley didn't say anything for a long moment. She was recoiling a lead rope, and she kept recoiling it, her hands steady. "Is that what Douglas wants?" she said finally. "Douglas didn't tell them anything," Pete said. "He said he hadn't decided." She nodded, went back to the rope. That night, she didn't sleep well. Not because of the offer. She wasn't surprised that other operations would be interested once word spread, and she'd had enough of moving from place to place to know that money alone was a poor reason to stay anywhere. What kept her awake was the realization that she'd stopped thinking of Clearwater as a temporary placement. At some point in the last 6 weeks, without marking it, she'd started thinking of the North Pasture as her North Pasture. The cold mornings at the fence line had become the thing she oriented her day around. Iron Ridge, this complicated, damaged animal who was slowly, painstakingly learning that stillness wasn't the same as danger. She cared about what happened to him. She cared in the specific way you care about things you've spent your silence on. She got up at 5 and went to the fence. Iron Ridge came to her in 11 minutes. That was the fastest he'd ever crossed the pasture. He stopped at 6 feet and stood there in the blue pre-dawn, his breath coming in long, slow streams, and he didn't lower his head this time. He looked at her, directly, without the sideways wariness that had been his default. Just looked, the way animals look when they've stopped needing to decide. Hadley reached out her hand, slowly with no intention in it, palm flat. He took one more step. His nose touched her palm. She didn't move, didn't speak. She stood there in the cold with her hand against the face of an animal that had put 3 people in the hospital, and she felt him breathe, felt the long, warm exhale against her skin, and she thought about her father's place in Stavely, about all the things that had been broken too soon, about how long it actually takes to repair a thing that's been frightened badly enough. And she thought maybe that was all this had ever been about, the patience to stay in the cold long enough for the frightened thing to come to you. She heard boots on the frozen ground behind her. Douglas had been up early. He sometimes was, those hours before the ranch needed him, when he walked the property the way she walked it, alone, looking at things, taking account. He'd seen her at the fence from the kitchen window and come out without his coffee. And now he stood 10 feet back, not speaking, watching Iron Ridge stand nose to palm with the woman he'd been skeptical of for the first 3 days of April. He stood there for a long time. Finally Hadley said, without turning around, "You should call Fort McLeod back." Douglas was quiet. "Tell them she's not available." A long pause. The bull shifted his weight, comfortable, unbothered. "I was going to tell them that anyway," Douglas said. She turned around then, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man who decided something, and it was the same expression she'd seen him wear when he talked about the ranch. Not sentimental exactly, but certain. The way people look at things they've chosen to be responsible for. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. "Same reason you didn't ask," he said. The morning came up slowly over the Porcupine Hills, pale and clear, and behind her Iron Ridge moved back to his, grazing the way he always had, unhurried, owning his ground. The hands heard about it at breakfast. Not from Douglas, not from Hadley. From Pete, who had been awake too and seen enough from the barn window to understand what had happened. By the time the coffee was poured, Corey was grinning. Wade had 100 questions he didn't know how to ask. The oldest hand, a weathered man from Cardston named Abe, who'd said almost nothing to Hadley in 6 weeks, put his mug down and looked at her across the table and said, "That bull hasn't let a person that close in 3 years." "I know," she said. "How'd you do it?" Hadley thought about it. "I stopped trying to." Abe looked at her for another moment, and then he nodded, slowly, once, the way men of a certain age nod when someone has confirmed something they already half believed. Spring came to Clearwater the way it always does, in the foothills, in stages, reluctantly, with setbacks. There were still cold nights in May, still mornings when the mud froze hard and the light came late and the work was the same. Difficult work it had always been. But something had changed in the texture of the days, something in the ease of the mornings when Hadley walked out and Iron Ridge lifted his head and moved toward her with the calm certainty of a creature who has decided where he belongs. Douglas named her head handler in June. He didn't make a ceremony of it. He told her over the fence one morning while they both watched the bull graze, and she said, yes, the same way she'd said everything on this ranch, simply, without performance, as though it were already true and just needed to be spoken aloud. Iron Ridge got a new name too. It was Wade's idea, offered shyly at dinner one evening, and it was so right that no one even argued. They called him Clearwater now, after the ranch, after the creek that ran cold and clean along the east pasture, after the simple fact that some things, given enough time and the right kind of attention, become exactly what they were always capable of being. I keep thinking about the morning Hadley put her hand out and the bull walked to her. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't really. It was quiet, pre-dawn, cold, no one watching except Douglas from a distance he thought was far enough. What stays with me is what she said afterward, when Abe asked how she'd done it. She said she'd stopped trying, and I think that's the part that's hardest to explain to people who haven't worked with something broken before. That the trying, the visible, effortful trying, is sometimes exactly what keeps the frightened thing away. Hadley didn't arrive at Clearwater with the right credentials, or the right look, or any of the signals that usually make people extend trust quickly. She arrived with a letter no one checked, and a truck with a broken heater, and a method that looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. That's the thing about a certain kind of intelligence. It doesn't announce itself. It just keeps showing up at the fence at the same time every morning, until the distance between two frightened things gets small enough to matter. What she had wasn't luck, it was something that had been built over years, quietly, in the particular school of paying attention. She understood that Iron Ridge wasn't aggressive, he was afraid, and those two things look identical from the outside, but require completely opposite responses. Meeting fear with force makes it worse. Meeting it with steadiness, with the willingness to simply be present without demand. That's what changes the thing over time. That's what she knew that 3 previous handlers hadn't. And then there was Scout, bleeding in the south pasture with the bull watching from the fence line. That moment wasn't planned. She didn't have time to think about method or approach. She just did what she'd trained herself to do. Move without panic, speak without urgency, be the calmest thing in the space. That kind of steadiness in a crisis isn't a personality trait you're born with. It's the result of having chosen, over and over again, to hold yourself together when the easier thing would be to run. I think about Douglas too. A man who'd kept an animal most people wanted put down. Not out of sentimentality exactly, but out of some stubborn belief that the animal was worth the patience. He recognized something in Hadley before he had words for it, and he had the decency not to rush his own understanding. That's its own kind of integrity, knowing the difference between skepticism that protects you and skepticism that just keeps good things at arm's length. There's a line I can't get out of my head. The one Hadley said at the fence the morning everything changed. He doesn't need to be afraid anymore. He just needed someone to show him that. I've been turning it over ever since, because I think most of the difficult things in a life, the people, the situations, the parts of yourself you can't quite reach, are less about being fixed and more about being shown, repeatedly and without theatrics, that stillness is possible. That not everything ends in harm. Clearwater. That's what they named him. After the ranch, after the creek, after the fact that some things, given enough of the right kind of attention, become exactly what they always were capable of being. I think that's worth staying for.